Hi everyone, this is Rosanna. Neither of the workshop recordings are suitable to sort of send around to you. The one yesterday just sort of didn't really work. So I've decided to record this at home and just run through everything I did in my introduction. So if you were at the live, you can go over anything, or if you weren't able to make it, you will be able to start making something on your bag. So if you don't know me, I'm Rosanna and I've lived in Streatham for 4 years. I've been volunteering with the Woodfield since the beginning of this year, and I run a monthly sewing session on the third Saturday of the month. For those of you who aren't familiar with Woodfield, it's run by the charity Woodfield Project, of which I am a trustee. We aim to develop the pavilion as a centre for local communities and schools to share in culture, health, well-being, and to also champion the sustainability and the natural environment of the Tooting Commons where the pavilion is situated. And we really rely on people like you supporting and getting involved in our activities to keep going. If you aren't already a member of the charity, I really recommend that you become one. It's only £10 a year and means you get to support us even further. It's a really great part for our funding applications to show that we have members, and you get to be part of a community and vote at our AGMs as well. I myself am from an arts background. I studied fine art and history of art at university, but I started embroidery about 4.5 years ago as a way to be creative for myself. When I left work, you don't have a studio anymore, you don't have access to all those materials anymore, so I found that I just wasn't sort of doing anything creative for a while. So I picked up embroidery as a way to do my own work, and I want to show that embroidery is fun, it can be modern, and also cheap and easy to pick up. So hopefully you will see that and feel that by the end of my introduction and once you've started making stuff. And I've brought some examples of my work. So here's an example. I've done a series of sort of piercing and sort of facial, like skin things as well. There's this one that nearly broke me because it's all tiny individual stitching on the stubble there. As you can see, I like doing mouths. This is actually my smile. If you can see that. But I've also done some more text-based work these really sort of embody my values. This piece was a Black Lives Matter piece that I did earlier in the year. I've also done hanging artworks for friends and stuff before as well. This is one of mine, a very recent piece I've done, and I'm sort of experimenting with rhinestones and glitz a bit more as well. So I might make brooches and patches. And I got involved in Streatham Festival to share my love of embroidery and hopefully show, as I said, that it's fun, playful, fairly cheap, and also really good for mental well-being, which I think is more important now than ever. I want to give a shout out to the Sewing and Craft Superstore in Tooting by Tooting Beck Station. It's an amazing resource for crafty people. It's on two levels, and I try and buy all of my materials from them and support a local business, as big haberdasheries like that are few and far between now. But in general, you can get, offcuts of fabric for less than £1, fat quarters, which is a quarter square of a metre for like £1.50. Threads cost like £1, or you can buy them in bulk online and they're even cheaper. And hoops also can be very reasonable depending on the size and the style that you get. The hoop that we're working with would have been, on its own about £3, something like that. So all in all, like, you can start making something for £5 or £6. So I think that's very reasonable, and it's a cheap and cheerful craft to do. So I'm going to go through for about maybe 45 minutes how to mount a hoop, thread a needle, and I'm going to go through some of the basic stitches so you can get onto embroidering on your tote bag or whatever else you want to embroider on. It's totally up to you. I'm not prescriptive about what you sew. What you do with your kit and what images you want to choose is completely up to you. In terms of stitches, there are many stitches that you can learn. I've got a little example hoop here where I've done sort of various ones to show people what they actually look like in stitching, rather than just sort of like in a drawing that you can see online. So I've got my example hoop there. There's, as I said, there's lots of different ones you can do, but in my work, I actually really only use 2 stitches, which is backstitch to outline shapes and satin stitch to fill it in. I use satin stitch more than anything. So this is all satin stitch, and the black in between the teeth is backstitch, just to create that solid outline. But it's really simple. My work's more about sort of like what I'm making than how I'm making it. But if you want to learn lots of different stitches, you can get some really nice textures, like especially from something like a French knot, a bit more 3D. This feather stitch always reminds me of sort of seaweed, but it's also, I've seen it done really nicely as a border. You know, you could go circular, sort of around something. It looks really nice. Herringbones, just a really nice looking, really easy crisscross. The spider's web as well there, where you just sort of wrap the thread around some spokes. So definitely have a look at threads online. You can just type in embroidery stitches, and you can get an array of tutorials and things coming up. I've also got a handout that I use for my workshops that I've taken a picture of, and will circulate it to you all with this video as well. But in terms of today, we're going to be doing just 2 stitches, which is, sorry, we'll be doing backstitch and satin stitch, but I'll also do a few other stitches, which I'll go through in a bit. I just want to talk about fabric as well. Non-stretch fabric is best, something like cotton or linen, calico. This is calico I have here. It needs to be, I mean, if you can get a needle through it, you can embroider on anything, but non-stretch is best, especially to start with and practice with. And that is why you use the hoop, because it doesn't stretch out the fabric. You couldn't use a hoop on a stretchy fabric, because you would sort of stretch it out, and then when you take the hoop off, it would all buckle up and your work would all just sort of like go. Whereas with a nice non-stretch fabric, you're just pulling it taut in the hoop like that. So definitely start with non-stretch to practice with. If you're embroidering on clothing, which I do sometimes, you can just like really like nicely embellish and add to your clothes. It's worth considering how it's going to feel against the skin. Obviously you'll have stitching on the back, and you just want to think about, you know, how that might feel if you haven't got any sort of like panel underneath or anything. So just be wary of that if you ever want to embroider on clothes. In terms of hoops, you can get plastic or wood. Wood it's more popular. I was always taught to use the smallest hoop for the design. The smaller the hoop, the easier it is to control. We're using 6-inch hoops, which I think is a nice beginning size. It's not too small, but it's not too big either. The 6-inch hoops are obviously smaller than the tote bags, but if you're doing a larger design, rather than using necessarily a big hoop, you can use a smaller hoop, and move it around the fabric as you're going, rather than having to use, you can use big hoops, but if starting out, I'd recommend using a smaller one and just getting a bit more of a feel for it, and you can just move your hoop around your bag or whatever it is you're doing to do the design that way. You're not constrained to a 6-inch design on your bag. So I just wanted to say that you can do something bigger and just move the hoop around. Needles, embroidery needles are often called crewel needles that have a small eye and a sharp tip. That's one of mine there. I've got you slightly bigger needles to work with, as they're easier to thread by eye, and a bigger needle is easier to work with for a beginner. Thicker fabrics like twill or denim would require a stronger and sturdier needle as well. It sort of depends on the fabric you're working with. So the needle might potentially be a bit too big and too thick for the material, but I think that it's a really good one to start with. This is one of mine, an actual embroidery needle, which you can see is a bit smaller. The eye's not as big, but I can go through how to use a needle threader as well. I really recommend using those if you're struggling, so I'll go through that in a second. But just to talk about thread as well, embroidery thread can also be called floss, and the thread that you have in your kits, in sort of those loops with the paper holding it together, they are called skeins or skeins, depending on how you pronounce it. It's S-K-E-I-N, so thread skeins. The most common thread is made out of cotton. Again, it's a non-stretch. DMC and Anchor are two of the main brands, but you can get all different kinds of brands. The threads themselves are, if you have a look at them, are made up of 6 individual strands. Let me just pull this one apart to show you. There. So this strand itself is woven with 6 individual strands, and that allows you to control the thickness of your thread. I would recommend doing 3 and 3. I very rarely do more than that, actually, but it depends on the fabric you have, the design you're doing, the needle you're working with. But 3 and 3 strands and 3 strands is a nice one to work with, and I often, for my sort of main colours, do work with 3, and then I'll go down to 2 and 1 for some of the more intricate shading. As you can see, these little threads here, that would have been like 1 thread, just for that more sort of like subtle shading there. So because it's wrapped into 6, it just allows you to sort of have that ability to change the thickness of your thread depending on what design you're doing. So let's get on to mounting your hoop. That's the first step. We can't start without our fabric being in our hoop. And then I'm going to talk through how to thread your needle as well, because we can't start practicing stitches without our needle and our thread. So you will see on your hoop that it's made up of an inner circle and an outer circle. So let me just take this one apart. There we go. If you take it apart, you've got a smaller inner circle and a bigger outer circle with this mechanism at the top there. You want to place the inner circle underneath your spare bit of fabric. You have spare bits of fabric in your kit for this very purpose, so we're practicing with that. You want to place the inner circle, the inner ring, underneath and central underneath your fabric like that. Once you're happy with that and happy with that placement, you then place the outer ring on top, and I'm going to keep the tightening mechanism the side of my dominant hand. So I'm right-handed and this is my right hand, so I'm going to keep it this side. If you're left-handed, I would recommend having it the other side, because especially when you get nearer the end of your tightening, it can become a bit stiff. So I always recommend using your dominant hand. You place it on top like that, and you just want to tighten it as much as you can. And you'll see here, my fabric isn't lying flat. We don't want that. It's got some movement to it. So we want to pull the fabric taut through the hoop. So that hoop is going to squeeze the fabric and hold it in place and allow us to tighten the fabric. And you just want to keep tightening and pulling. Don't be shy with it. It's not gonna break. It's a non-stretch fabric for this very reason. And if sometimes, depending on the weave of your fabric, you can actually have a look, and if you see any sort of waves in the weave, you know that you need to pull it one side a bit more to get that weave as straight as possible. And it should sound like, you can hear that, it should have like a drum sound when it's tight. And you can see now it's nice and flat. It's not really giving me any sort of dip or anything like that when I push on it. And this is something you're going to have to do throughout your design. Naturally, as you're sewing and pulling the thread through the fabric is going to loosen. And anytime you notice that happening, you want to stop and tighten it. Because if you let the fabric go slack, you can risk buckling your thread and buckling the design, like I spoke earlier. So you could end up sort of like pinching the fabric a bit if it's not flat enough. Now this is nice and tight. When I do my design and take the hoop off, it's going to stay that way, and it's going to stay nice and flat. So we have our hoop nice and primed and ready. Now we need to thread our needle. So we have our needle here, just put that in my fabric so I didn't lose it. Then I need my thread. Now I was always taught to take about an elbow's width of thread. So I always hold it up like that. And when I get down to my elbow, don't worry about being really exact. Down to my elbow, and then I'm going to cut it. This is because the temptation is naturally to cut as much thread as possible, because that means you don't have to cast off as often, which would be the dream. But the longer the thread, the more likely it's going to tie itself in knots anyway, and that's actually more annoying because then you have to unknot it, and if it's too big of a knot, you might have to cut it and start over again. So don't do more than your elbow length because you don't want it to tie itself in knots. Then we're going to do 3 and 3. So you just want to separate out your thread into 3 and 3 like that. I've got that there. And then because this thread is quite silky, it should just pull apart like this. So you just pull it apart. If it's giving some tension and not wanting to pull apart, what I do is I then grab in my non-dominant hand, this is my left hand, between my thumb and my index finger. I've got one side and the rest of my fingers are holding the other side. And then I'm just going to twist with my right hand, my dominant hand. I'm going to twist and unravel those threads that way because the threads are all really tightly wrapped in a spiral. So you want to sort of just tease it out like that. Another way that I've seen people do, which I don't particularly like because it can sort of bunch up the thread, but another way, you separate them out like that at the top, and you sort of hold loosely the thread, you know, a bit down like that, and you pull like that. But it sort of does bundle up the other threads a little bit. So it's not my favorite method, but I have seen people do that, and if that's your preferred method, that is totally fine. So we have our thread. Now we need to put it through our needle. Now my needle's a bit smaller, and I do want to show you how to use a needle threader. There isn't one as part of your packs, and I think in hindsight I would have included a needle threader, so that's some learning for me. But you have a needle threader, which is an ingenious tool. It looks a bit scary, and I've been told quite often that people have seen them in, you know, sewing kits that they get, and they're just like, what is that? But it is really, really useful if you struggle to thread needles, and I do as well. Especially, it depends on the thread, it depends on the needle. Sometimes I can do it by eye, but if I'm struggling, one of these is just a lifesaver. So it has a little wire diamond at the top. So this is wire. The holder bit is plastic, but sometimes these are metal as well. It just depends on the ones that you get. I got a pack of them for like £4 or something online. They're really, really cheap. A singular one in a haberdashery would be like 10p, 20p, something like that. And they can break, they're not flawless, depending on how hard you're pulling with them. But they're so cheap, I just recommend getting a few of them for when you need them. So it's got this wire diamond at the top. That is going to go through the eye of your needle. So you're going to thread that through the eye. And then the needle can just hang down like that. Don't even have to hold it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put the thread through the diamond like that. So my thread is through the diamond. You can just, again, I can just hold it. So I've put that through like that. Then what you're going to do is you're going to pull that wire diamond back through the eye of the needle, and it's going to take the thread with it. So I've got it through the diamond, and I'm just going to pull, and it's going to pull the end of that thread with it. And there we go. I have threaded my needle. Brilliant. Then I'm just going to put a knot in the end of it. And there are ways of embroidering without knotting, and I myself am trying to do that more and more. Firstly, for from an environmental perspective, because if you unless your knot is right at the end of your fabric, I'm not very good at right at the end of your thread, and I'm not very good at doing that. You end up with a little tail like that that you trim off, and obviously it's a tiny bit of waste, but it's still waste. So I'm trying to use all of the thread, so I don't actually knot, or I try not to, depending on the design I'm doing. The other reason is because if you're making something like this, like a brooch or a patch or something like that, the knots on the underside are going to create lumps, and it's not going to lie nice and flat. So again, depending on what you're doing, if you're embroidering on clothes, for example, that's something to consider. But of course, when you're starting out, it is a lot easier to use knots. So I recommend that we do that for now, because there's nothing worse than, you know, doing something and then you're not, you know, it all comes unthreaded, and it's just, you have to sort of poke the thread back through the fabric. So we've got our hoop and our material and our threaded needle. Now we can actually get on to practicing some stitching. So I'm actually going to start with the most basic stitch, which is running stitch, and tends to be the one that people are most familiar with if you did stitching or cross stitches at school. And running stitch is very simple. It's literally just lines of stitches with some gaps in between. It looks sort of like the middle of road markings. That's what it always looks like to me in my head. So it's really easy. And if you're comfortable running stitch, feel free to skip over this bit, but I'm not going to assume any knowledge. And it's absolutely fine if you've never done this before. So you just come up from underneath. Our thread's not going to come through because we tied a little knot. And then you just want to go, I'm going left to right because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you can go right to left. If that's easier for you, it doesn't matter. But I'm going right to left, so I've come up and I've gone to the right and I've come down, so I've got a little stitch there. Then I'm just going to come up the same distance away because I'm going to keep it nice and even underneath my fabric. I'm going to come up, I'm just going to do the same again. I'm going to go down to the right. I'm trying to keep that nice and even, but don't worry about it too much. And again, you come up from underneath and then go down. And that's running stitch, because it looks like you're running. Like if you're running, imagine your feet go dum, dum, dum. It's running along the fabric like that. So that's running stitch. Back stitch starts exactly the same as running stitch. The difference is after the first stitch going forward, we then actually go backwards and connect with the previous stitch. So back stitch is really nice because you get a continuous line. Where's my practice hoop? Oh, I don't actually have back stitch on here. Okay, well, let's just go for it. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to start like running stitch. So the first stitch in back stitch is forward. So I've gone, and it looks like I'm about to do running stitch. It still looks like I'm going to do running stitch because I'm going to come up the same distance away from that thread. So far it just still looks like running stitch. But instead of going forward again, you know, in the direction that the thread is traveling in, instead of going down there, I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to go down inside the same hole of the end of the previous stitch. I'm going to go down into that same hole like that, and it's going to connect those two stitches together. And then I'm going to repeat that. You don't go forward anymore. So I'm not going to come up there and go forward. I'm going to come up the same distance away there, and I'm going to go back. You want to make sure you're going into the same hole, because if I come up and I don't go into the same hole, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit. You're going to get a gap, so it looks more like a close running stitch. And you don't want that, because back stitch, you want that continuous line like that. Don't worry if you mess it up a little bit, just keep going and keep practicing that until you feel comfortable. But I'm going to move on, so feel free to pause there if you want some more time with that. We are then going to practice, eventually we're going to do a circle in back stitch, because we're going to practice satin stitch. But I had a request to go through a few more sort of outliney stitches, because you might want to write something in text on your tote bag, and there's some other stitches that are really nice for text as well as back stitch, or you could use running stitch, but they're outline stitch here, split stitch and chain stitch as well. So I'm just going to quickly go through those, because if you wanted to do, they're good for making texture, but they're also really good for text as well. So I'm going to start with split stitch, and split stitch is very similar to running stitch. The difference is the stitches sort of overlap each other. So I've started like running stitch, but instead of giving that previous stitch some space, I'm going to pierce right through it. There we are, my needle's literally piercing right in the center between those stitches. And that's why it's called split stitch, because you're splitting the previous stitch. And then you just continue forward and I'm going to come up in between that stitch. See if I can see it. Oh. It's a bit fiddly, but yeah, I'm going to come up in the center of that stitch and go forward. Now, of course, this isn't going to work unless you have multiple stitches. If you've only got one stitch, one thread, it's not going to work. We're working with 3, so that means we can split it. 2 and up, you are able to split. And there we go. You just keep on going like that. Very simple. So it's like running stitch if running stitch is sort of like overlapped like that rather than having gaps. So that's split stitch. I don't really use split stitch because you'll see if you look very closely on yours, it's a bit fuzzy on mine, but you can very subtly see the fabric coming through that thread because you've split them open a little bit. So you can actually see the fabric underneath, which isn't particularly something that I want in my work, but that might be something that you want in yours. It's just completely up to you, but that is split stitch. Then outline stitch is very similar, but instead of piercing through the previous stitch, you want to sort of come up alongside it. So split stitch is like this, outline stitch is like this. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So I've come up as normal and I've gone forward like I have with the previous stitches. Now, instead of coming up and piercing that stitch like split stitch, I don't want to do that because then I'm not doing outline stitch, I'm doing split stitch. I want to come up alongside that stitch. Can you see that? So I'm coming up in the middle of it, but I'm skimming, and I find having my needle at an angle is easier because if I come straight up through the fabric, sometimes you can just end up doing a split stitch. So you can sort of come up an angle and sort of skim the underneath of that thread. And you just come up and you just go down again. There we go. So those threads are alongside one another. And to keep a nice sort of balance to the line, you can alternate which side of the previous stitch you come up at. So I came up the previous stitch at the bottom. Now I'm going to come up at the top, and again I'm going to skim that previous stitch like that. I'm now on top of it. I'm going to skim it. I'm just going to go forward like that. And do that again. There we are. You can see they're sort of existing alongside each other that way, and that's outline stitch. The difference being that you're not coming up in the middle of that thread because that's split stitch. You're going alongside, threads go alongside each other like that. So that's outline stitch. Now I'm running out of thread, so to do the chain stitch, which uses a bit more thread, I'm going to cast off. And how I do that is fairly simple. So when you've got more than one thread, what I recommend doing is literally just splitting. So we've got three threads here. So what I'm going to do is split 2 to 1. There we go. So I've got 2 and 1. And then I'm just going to tie that in a knot. And I'm going to double knot it like that. So I've got a knot at the back now, and I can just cut that off. Done. There are ways of casting off that don't use knots. Of course, if you've only got one thread, you can't do that. And what that then involves is basically doing like a loop underneath your previous stitching. So I would do a loop underneath like that, and then go through and pull. So I would end up, you know, if I've got a thread here, I can go underneath a previous stitch and it creates a loop in the thread, and then I can just go through that with my needle and pull, and that will create a knot. There's other ways of doing it where you might have multiple threads, but you're doing something like a patch, so you actually don't want to create a knot at the back. I'm trying to find an example. And one way of doing that is by going underneath. Let's see if I can find one. Well, so this has no knots at the back. This is a patch and it's got no knots at the back, because obviously then it wouldn't be able to lie flat if it was all knotty. So what I actually do when I'm casting off is go underneath the satin stitch like that, and you just pull, and the thread then is lying underneath the satin stitch. So this will have loads of like tails of thread underneath it that you can't see. And you know, it's not going to come undone. You'd have to sort of like pick it and pull it out for it to come undone. It's pretty secure, so you can literally just go underneath your thread like that and pull it, and the tail will just stay there. So that's another way of doing it. But for now, we're going to knot, because there's nothing worse than things becoming unraveled because you haven't knotted it. So I'm just going to thread my needle again using the needle threader. Let's pulled it a little bit. That's something that happens sometimes when you're working with multiple threads. Sometimes one thread can get pulled more than the other, but that's fine. You just sort of even them out again. There we go. Do a knot, double knot in the end. Now I'm going to do chain stitch. Chain stitch is more fiddly. It's more of a two-handed stitch, to be honest. But, oh, I have an example of it actually that I can show you. So the have on this piece is done with chain stitch. I gave up with it though, because the gold wasn't really playing ball with me, but you can see there a little bit like the little chains that I've created. So I did use chain stitch on that, and it creates a nice thickness and a nice sort of texture. So you're going to come up as normal, but we're not going to go anywhere with our thread this time. We're not going to go forward, we're not going to go back, we're going to go down the same hole you just came out of. Now somebody in the workshop said, quite rightly, but if you go down into the same hole, nothing's going to happen. You're just going to pull the thread back out, which is very correct. So what you don't want to do is pull the thread in the same hole all the way through. So I'm going down the same hole. Another thing to be aware of is, because you're going down the same hole, you want to make sure that you're not going to pierce with your needle that knot that we've got in the end of our thread, because that just doesn't work, and it's just going to get all tangled up. So I sort of pull with my index finger that knot away a little bit, you know, because I don't want it to be right there. I'm going to pull that away a little bit so my needle doesn't go through it. Then I'm going to leave a little chain, a little loop there. Now, someone also mentioned that their thread kept getting twisted. And that is quite common, because obviously the thread has been twisted up for so long, it's just going to naturally twist. That's fine. Again, it's just sort of like you might have to sort of hold it open like that, like tease it open a little bit with your needle and your finger. I find it sort of easier to hold it down with my thumbnail like that. So this is our loop. And if I just wanted to create a single loop, I would then come up inside it and I would just anchor it down. So I've come up inside that loop, and then I'm pulling it tight. Now it's tight. And I'm just going to go the other side to anchor it down. There we are. So I'm going down the other side, and that's just going to anchor that loop into place with a little stitch. There, you can see that. So that's one way of doing a single loop, and sometimes people use chain stitch for petals. Lazy daisy stitch, for example, is literally just a series of chains, but in a circle to make something that looks like a flower. So that is literally chain stitch to make a daisy. But to do a line of chain stitch, how you do that is by creating interlocking loops with your fabric. So I'm just going to come away from that chain. I'm going to go down inside the same hole. I'm going to pull it. It's going to twist. I'm just going to work that out a little bit with my hands. I'm doing quite big ones for the purposes of showing you, but chain stitch can also be very delicate. So there we are. I've got my next loop, and then I'm going to come up again, and the key is to then pull that. It's because it's not going to go anywhere. You've come up inside it, and the key is then to pull it so the chain becomes taut. Instead of going down the other side to anchor it, I'm actually going to go down inside the same hole and create another loop. There we go. So I've created a loop inside another loop. This is my first loop, and then this is my second one that's coming from inside it there. But I need to anchor that one down. How do I anchor that one down? I anchor this one down with another loop. So I'm gonna, don't worry about making it even. So I'm gonna come up again in the middle of that second loop, pull it tight, and I'm gonna go down in the same hole. So I've created a third loop there. I'm going to come up inside it. I'm going to pull. And again, I'm going to go down. Come up. And it's easier to actually have the loop a bit wider like that when you come up, because when you pull the thread from inside the hoop, it's going to tighten. There's no need to tighten that hoop before you come up through it. So I've actually kept it really loose. Now I'm going to come up, and then I'm going to pull, and that's going to tighten it. And that's how you do chain stitch. You just do loops within loops within loops. And then when you're done with your chain stitch, you just, like I showed you with the first one, you just do a little stitch on the other side of that loop to anchor it down. And it's not going to go anywhere. So that is our chain stitch. Wonderful. So those are the 4, well, how many stitches have we done so far? We've done 5 stitches already. Running, back, split, outline, and chain. Now I'm going to show you satin stitch, which is a really great filling in stitch and my favourite stitch to fill in with. There are other ones, and I mean, really, you can fill in with any stitch. You can fill in with back stitch, you can fill in with chain stitch. Depending on what you're making, you can do whatever you want. But I like satin stitch because I like to be able to sort of, you know, create dimension with it, and it just has a bit more of a smoothness to it. So got a bit of unevenness there. Double knot it. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to create a circle in back stitch. I've already done one. Here's one I made earlier. So I want you to make a circle by doing back stitch. Don't worry about making it really perfect. This isn't the perfect circle, don't worry. And don't make a really small circle. You know, this is quite big actually, but yeah, make a circle with back stitch. Remember, back stitch, this one here, the second one we did, you come up like running stitch, but then you come up here, but instead of going forward, you're going to go back into that same hole, and you're going to loop back like that, loop, 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 loop. You need to create a circle. Why a circle is because it's easier to do satin stitch on a square or a rectangle, because your stitching can all be the same length. Whereas with a circle, I'm going to go small stitches here, and then I'm going to go bigger, and I'm going to go down to smaller. So it's more of a challenge. If you are struggling, feel free to just do a square and practice just going up and down with satin stitch. Satin stitch, I don't actually have it on here, but this is made with satin stitch here. So it's literally just up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. There are other ones like long and short stitch here, which is quite good for shading, because you basically you can create sort of interlocking threads like that. So if you had like one color and then the other, they sort of like can mesh better than just having like blocks of thread like that. But I just prefer satin stitch and to do overlaying satin stitches like this one that you can see. This looks like long and short, but really it's just satin stitch that I've overlaid as I've gone through the different colours. But long and short is another very common filling in stitch. In terms of satin stitch, yeah, it's literally just like what you do with a pen, you know, or a pencil, where you're shading, go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. That is satin stitch, but with thread. To do it with a circle, you should always start sort of one end and work to the other. And I'm right-handed, so I'm going to go left to right. You should always also go the shortest amount of distance possible. So say if I had, you know, if I had sort of a long rectangle upwards like that, I wouldn't go satin stitch the long way. I'd go satin stitch the horizontal way, because that size of thread, it would be really, really long. So you want your thread to travel sort of like the least distance as possible, depending on the shape you are doing. So for here example, like I wouldn't do satin stitch across that way. I've done it that way. You can also create really nice dimension with satin stitch. So for my lips, for example, my satin stitch is actually, that's not a very good one. You can't really see that. Let's see if you can see this one. So here you'll notice my satin stitch is actually on the horizontal. I'm going from here to here. But here my satin stitch is vertical. So from here, the corner to the middle, I've angled my satin stitch around, and you can see some of them here on the diagonal. I've actually angled my satin stitch around like that, because that creates more of a shape and more of a dimension than if I just went up, down like this. If I just went on the vertical the whole time, the lips would look quite flat. And more sort of cartoony. I mean, that's fine if that's the look you're going for, but I want sort of more dimension, especially with these ones that are a little bit 3D. It just helps to sort of like make them look even more three-dimensional. So I recommend practicing that as well, practicing the angles with your satin stitch as well. But so to actually do satin stitch, similarly to what I showed you with outline, you don't want to pierce through your back stitch, because you might end up being able to see this fabric from underneath, and we don't want that. You also want to go inside the back stitch. So the satin stitch doesn't go over the back stitch, because otherwise there would be no point in doing it. The back stitch is containing that satin stitch. You want to go inside the circle. And similarly with outline, the trick that I use to make sure I don't pierce through my outline is I'm just going to angle my needle to skim underneath the thread. So I'm going to skim like that. I'm going to come up. And I'm going to do the same back down. I'm going to angle my needle back down underneath. As if I went just straight down, I might end up actually not meeting the line and having a little bit of a gap, or I might end up piercing through the thread, which I don't want to do. So to get to as close to that line as possible without piercing it, I'm going to angle my thread down a little bit. And there we go. Now I can see there's a little bit of a gap there. That's absolutely fine. I'm just going to go back a little bit. Yeah. So if you notice gaps at any point, just go back and fill it in. And you just want to carry on like that, literally. It's very repetitive. But you can sort of just zone out. It's very therapeutic. It's very satisfying. There we are. And you can see it's come up underneath as well. There are ways of doing satin stitch where you don't use as much thread. We are using quite a lot of thread because we're also we're effectively doing a satin stitch on the front and on the back, because you're going up, down, up, down, up, down. There is a way of, if you're, say, running out of thread, which I have done before, there is a way of conserving thread with satin stitch, and you can see an example of it on the back here, where I'm not doing one on the back. I've got, look, it's satin stitch on the front, it's all filled in on the front, but the back, there's nothing there. And how you do that is, rather than going up, down, up, down, up, down, you go up, down, then go next to that down thread and go up again. So you're going sort of like, you know, up, down, across, down, up, across, up, down, across, down, up, across. And I'll show you it now. Actually, I'll go next to the previous thread there. So I'm going to go up, down like normal. But instead of circling back and underneath, instead of circling back like that, I'm actually going to go as close to that previous stitch as possible without going through the same hole. If I go through the same hole, it's going to come out. But you want to go as close to that down hole as possible. So I haven't looped it at the back. And then I'm just going to go next to it up here. And I'm going to do that again. So I've just gone down, up, and I want to go up, down again. So I'm just going to come as close to that other thread as possible and go down like that. So it looks like a normal satin stitch on the back, but there's nothing, sorry, on the front, but there's nothing on the back. So that is one way you can do it. The only difference is that it then creates a very sort of front heavy design. So on something like this, for example, and these patches, I wouldn't want to do that technique, because then the front becomes really heavy and the back is sort of left open and vulnerable, you see there. If it was all done like that, there wouldn't be anything to secure it at the back. And that could potentially mean that threads come undone, or it's not going to hold together as well as you would like. So it's a good way of conserving thread, especially if you're running out. But unless it's necessary, I personally wouldn't do it. But it's up to you. And if you're covering a small surface area, it's not really a big deal anyway. I'm just casting off with my thread. There we are. Now you can do and fill in as much as that circle as you like. Do it until you feel comfortable with that thread. But you don't have to fill the whole circle if you feel like you've got to grips with it. You could also practice, you know, if you make a sort of triangle shape, you could also practice the angling of the satin stitch as well if you wanted to before moving on to your design. But I hope that was helpful. Those are the stitches that I went through in the workshop. As I said, there are loads that you can do, and I will send the handout round to you with the video. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or message me on social media. It's best on Instagram. I'm at rosanna.mcnamara. And also tag me and tag Woodfield in your beautiful creations. I would love to see what you've done on your bags and what you're continuing to make. You're more than welcome to come along to my monthly sewing session. It's called Sew What. And I always advertise that on Instagram as well as Facebook. There's always a Facebook event for it. Because we're in tier 2 now, the next one might be virtual. Well, there's one, it was meant to be on Saturday, it's meant to be yesterday, the October one, but because I was doing the workshop, I've postponed it to next Saturday. So the 24th, 2 till 4, we are doing a little sewing session. It's more informal, it's not a formal workshop like this. It's more of a sort of knit and natter, but I am there to help with embroidery. If you have any more questions, feel free to come and I can help you and I can show you. Or you can just come and have a chat, and it's just a place for like-minded crafty people to meet and skills share and chat and stuff like that. So you're more than welcome, and I hope to see you all again soon at Woodfield. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now and hope and pray that this time, third time lucky, it has worked. So thank you so much, and good luck with your stitching. I can't wait to see it. Bye.